My in-laws' religious tradition almost killed my newborn baby. The neonatologist used the word hours, and I heard it as a sentence, not a medical estimate, a verdict. My daughter was 11 days old, 4 pounds and 9 ounces, lying inside an incubator in the NICU at St. Raphael Regional Medical Center with a core temperature of 95.1 degrees Fahrenheit and a blood glucose level that the attending nurse described, in the careful tone of someone selecting each word for legal as much as medical reasons, as critically low. The doctor, a compact, precise woman named Dr. Yetunde Afolabi, 14 years in neonatal intensive care, told my husband Kofi and me that Sina had been found in a state consistent with prolonged cold exposure and significant caloric deprivation. She used those exact words, prolonged cold exposure, significant caloric deprivation. She said it looking at both of us, but the particular quality of her attention when she said it was pointed at something beyond the immediate medical facts, something she was deciding whether to say next. I looked at my husband. His face had the expression of a man who has just understood that two things he believed were separate are in fact the same thing. I didn't have that expression. I had been awake for 31 hours, and my body was still recovering from a cesarean section 11 days earlier, and my daughter was in a machine to keep her warm because someone had decided that keeping her warm was less important than a ritual I had been told, specifically and repeatedly, was harmless. I was not at the stage of understanding yet. I was at the stage of the room tilting. I had been married to Kofi Mensah for 4 years when Sina was born, and they were years I would describe, without significant qualification, as happy. Kofi was 33, an architect who worked at a firm downtown and who brought to most aspects of life the same careful attention he brought to structural drawings. Patient, detail-oriented, genuinely interested in getting things right. He was the kind of person who remembered what you said in passing 6 months ago and brought it up again when it became relevant, which is either charming or unsettling depending on your personality, and I had always found it charming. We had met at a mutual friend's birthday, married after 2 years, and bought a house in the kind of neighborhood where you know your neighbors' names, and they bring food when something goes wrong. I was 31 when Sina was born. I worked in urban planning for the city. I was, by any reasonable measure, a competent adult who made informed decisions about her life and had assembled the kind of careful, deliberate existence that competent adults assemble. I say all of this not to establish credentials, but to explain how completely I had failed to see what I was walking into. Because the failure is not explained by naivety or carelessness. It is explained by the specific architecture of trust, and by the way that architecture can be used against you by people who understand it well. Kofi's family was Ghanaian, 2 generations removed, and deeply religious in the evangelical tradition, which I had understood as warmly communal and occasionally intense. His mother, Abina Mensah, a retired schoolteacher who wore the same 3-strand pearl necklace to every event and had an opinion about every decision made within a 30-foot radius of herself, was the gravitational center of the family in the way that certain matriarchs are. Not through force exactly, but through the specific social pressure of a woman who has spent 68 years being the most certain person in any room. I had liked her, mostly. She was funny in the dry way of people who have survived difficult things and learned to find them absurd in retrospect. And she had treated me, from the beginning, with a kind of provisional warmth that I understood to mean I was acceptable as long as I deferred on the things that mattered to her. I had deferred on more than I should have. I understood that now. The first indication that something about the post-birth arrangements was different from what I'd been told came 3 days before Sina was released from the hospital. She had spent her first week in a standard NICU stay due to low birth weight, which was expected given her premature arrival at 36 weeks. Abina came to visit and mentioned, in the tone of someone reminding you of an appointment you'd already agreed to, that the family's naming ceremony would follow the traditional protocol. I said yes, assuming we had discussed this. We had discussed a naming ceremony. We had not, I would later understand, discussed the protocol. The naming ceremony in Kofi's family tradition, a specific branch of practice that his mother maintained with the fidelity of someone for whom the tradition was less cultural practice and more theological obligation, required the infant to spend the night before the ceremony outdoors. Not outside in a modern sense, outside in the original sense of the practice, which meant the baby was placed in the family's compound garden under open sky from sundown to sunrise, wrapped in white cloth, to be claimed by God before being named by the family. Abina presented this to me on the third day of Senna's NICU stay as a settled matter, using the phrase, "as it has always been done," in a tone that made it sound equivalent to, "as breathing has always been done." I said, clearly and without ambiguity, that our daughter had been born premature and was still medically fragile, and that no pediatrician on earth would sign off on an 11-day-old infant spending a night outdoors in October in a region where nighttime temperatures had been consistently dropping below 50 degrees. Abina looked at me with the expression of someone who has decided, well before the conversation began, that the other person's objections represent spiritual rather than practical incomprehension. She said, "God has kept every child through this ceremony for 5 generations. I said, "I understand that matters to you. My daughter is not spending the night outside." Kofi was present for this conversation. He did not support either position. He did what he often did when his mother and I disagreed, which was to look steadily at a point in the middle distance and wait for the moment to pass. I had learned over 4 years that this was not indifference. It was the trained response of a man who had grown up between 2 strong wills and had developed a practiced neutrality as a survival mechanism. I had never fully confronted the cost of that neutrality until it came due. The week between that conversation and the ceremony was the first escalation loop I did not recognize as escalation. Abina called 4 times. Each call began with a question about Sina's health and progressed through a series of conversational transitions I can now trace like a roadmap toward a reiteration of the ceremony's requirements. The first call established that the tradition was non-negotiable from her perspective. The second introduced the concept of the extended family's investment. Cousins, aunts, the family elder pastor Obeng Kwarti, who was flying in from Kumasi specifically for this event. The third introduced the implication that my resistance was cultural rather than medical, that I didn't understand because I wasn't from the tradition. The fourth was the one in which she told me that Kofi had agreed. I called Kofi immediately. He said he'd told his mother we'd figure something out, which he had decoded in his head as meaning we would find a compromise, and which his mother had decoded as meaning I had been overruled. I told him that was not what that meant. He said he knew. I asked him to call his mother and clarify. He said he would. He did not call that evening. The next morning, Abina arrived at our house with Kofi's aunt Ifua and 2 cousins I barely knew, and they began setting up the garden. I called our pediatrician, Dr. Priya Sundaram, who had been Sina's physician since before birth and who had 13 years in pediatric practice with a specific focus on premature infant development. I called her from our bedroom at 8:46 in the morning while I could hear Abina and Ifua talking in the garden below the window. Dr. Sundaram listened to what I described and then said, without hesitation, that a 36-week premature infant 11 days old should under no circumstances be exposed to outdoor temperatures below 60 degrees Fahrenheit for any extended period, that cold stress in premature infants caused metabolic consequences that could progress rapidly, and that she was prepared to put that in writing. She asked if I needed her to come to the house. I said I wasn't sure. She said, "Call me the moment anything changes." I went downstairs. Kofi was in the kitchen. His mother was in the garden, and through the window I could see her arranging a white cloth on the ground near the garden wall in what appeared to be a practiced motion, the motion of someone who had done this before and was doing it correctly. I put my phone on the kitchen counter with Dr. Sundaram's number still open. I said to Kofi, "Your mother is setting up a bed in the garden for our 11-day-old premature daughter, and I need you to tell her it's not happening." He looked at the window. He looked at me. He said, "I'll talk to her." He went outside. I watched through the window. I could not hear the conversation. It lasted 9 minutes. When he came back inside, he said his mother had agreed to a compromise. Sina would be outside only during the ritual itself, approximately 2 hours, with family members present the entire time. I said 2 hours outside at night in October with a premature infant was not a compromise. He said his mother was not going to change her position, and he needed me to understand what this meant to his family. I said I needed him to understand what this could mean to our daughter. We stood in the kitchen and looked at each other across a distance that had not existed that morning and that I understood, standing there, was going to take a long time to cross. The ceremony was scheduled for the following evening. I spent that day in a state I can only describe as a specific kind of cold alertness. Not panic, because panic is disorganized, and I was very organized. I called Dr. Sundaram again, and she emailed me, at my request, a written medical statement documenting her clinical objection to the proposed exposure. I printed it. I showed it to Kofi. He read it with the expression of a man reading something he already knew and had chosen not to fully absorb. I called the county's Child Protective Services information line to ask, hypothetically, what the legal framework was around a parent's obligation to prevent harm to an infant in a situation where extended family members were facilitating a potentially dangerous practice. The person on the line, a case intake coordinator who gave only his first name, Desmond, told me that parental responsibility to protect a child from harm superseded all cultural or religious practices, and that if I believed my child was in danger, I had both the right and the obligation to prevent that danger, and that if an infant was harmed as a result of religious practice, the parents could face charges depending on circumstances. I wrote down what he said. I showed Kofi. He said his mother would not let anything happen to Sina. I said, "You don't get to outsource that decision to your mother." He said nothing. That evening at 7:15 p.m., with the October air at 52 degrees according to the weather app on my phone, the ceremony began. I had Sena in my arms. Abina asked me to bring her outside. I said no. For the first time in the 4 years I had known her, Abina Mensa looked genuinely surprised. Not offended. Surprised the way someone looks when a door they have always found unlocked is suddenly locked. The surprise lasted approximately 3 seconds and then resolved into the expression of a woman who has decided that what is happening is a test of her authority, rather than a question she is required to engage with. She looked at Kofi. The look contained a full conversation I was not supposed to be a part of. Kofi looked at me. His face had the expression I had learned to dread. Not cruelty, but the absence of the particular courage that the moment required. He said, "Maybe just for the blessing part." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I went upstairs with Sina and locked the bedroom door and called Dr. Sundaram and told her what was happening. She said, "Stay where you are. Don't open the door." The family spent 20 minutes in escalating discussion outside the door that I could hear through the wood. Pastor Obenkorti's voice, deep and rhythmic, explaining in Twi and English that the ceremony could not proceed without the child and that the spiritual consequences of denial were significant. Ifua crying, which I do not think was strategic but was not helping. Abina, whose voice had shifted into the register of absolute certainty that I recognized from the kitchen window conversation as the register that meant she had stopped negotiating. Kofi's voice, threading through all of it, not directing any of it. At 9:30 p.m., I fell asleep sitting against the headboard with Sina in the bassinet beside me. I'd been awake since 4 that morning. I'd set an alarm for midnight. The alarm went off. I checked on Sina, who was sleeping and warm. I fell asleep again. What happened next took me 3 days to fully reconstruct, and the reconstruction required testimony from sources I will name. At some point between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., the bedroom door was opened. Kofi had a key. He had not used it while I was awake, and I will never know for certain, because he has never told me with specificity that I fully believe whether his mother asked him for it, or whether he gave it preemptively in some fog of exhausted family obligation. What I know is that Sina was taken from the bassinet while I slept. What I know is that she was outside in the October garden, in white cloth, for a period of between 90 minutes and 2 hours. What I know is that when I woke at 4:17 a.m. and found the bassinet empty, the specific cold quality of what I felt in my chest was not panic, but was something worse than panic. The bodily knowledge that I had failed at the one thing I had said I would not fail at. I found her in Abina's arms in the garden. She was not crying. Infants in the early stages of hypothermia often stop crying. I did not know that then. I know it now because Dr. Afolabi told me, standing in the NICU 14 hours later, that the cessation of crying is a late-stage symptom that people frequently misread as the child being calm. I called 911 at 4:22 a.m. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. The paramedics, a man named Jerome Asante and a woman whose name I did not catch, took Sina's temperature at 96.8 in the ambulance and were on the radio before the vehicle stopped moving. By the time we arrived at St. Raphael, Dr. Afolabi was already at the NICU entrance. Her 14 years showed in the speed with which she assessed and in the particular calm that did not perform reassurance but simply proceeded. She looked at Sina, looked at the vitals the paramedics had recorded, and made a decision about the incubator in a time frame I estimated at under 30 seconds. It was during this admission process that I told her, in a voice that I held together through something I cannot adequately name, what had happened. She listened. She made notes. She did not express an opinion in front of me at that point, but she asked for the name of our pediatrician, and when I said Dr. Sundaram, she nodded in a way that meant something I couldn't decode yet. Kofi was in the waiting room. I had not spoken to him since finding the bassinet empty. I had not spoken to Abena at all. She had followed us to the hospital. I was aware of this as a background fact and was filing it in a compartment I intended to address when my daughter was no longer in an incubator. Dr. Sundaram arrived at the hospital at 6:45 a.m. She had 13 years in pediatrics and the specific quality of a doctor who is both angry and professional in the way that produces maximum useful output from the anger. She reviewed Sina's chart, spoke with Dr. Afalabi for 12 minutes in the corridor. I watched through the window, watching their body language rather than trying to hear, and then came to me. She said the medical facts were clear. She said what she was about to say next was outside her clinical role, but she felt I needed to hear it from a physician before I heard it from anyone else. What had happened to my daughter met the legal threshold for medical neglect under state law. She was required, as a mandatory reporter, to file a report with Child Protective Services. She'd already called to initiate the process. I nodded. I did not feel what I expected to feel when she said that. I felt the specific clarity of a person who has been waiting, without knowing it, for the situation to have a name. Medical neglect. Mandatory reporter. The words had weight and shape, and the weight and shape meant that what had been done to Sina was no longer just a family disagreement. The CPS intake worker arrived at the hospital at 9:30 a.m. Her name was Constance Yaboa, and she had 11 years in Child Protective Services and the careful, listening manner of a person who has learned that the first version of every story is incomplete. She spoke with me for 40 minutes and Kofi for 30 minutes, separately. She reviewed Dr. Sundaram's written statement. She reviewed Dr. Afalabi's admission notes. She asked for the names of everyone who had been present during the ceremony and in the house during the night. She wrote everything in a bound notebook with a methodical hand. She told me, before she left, that the case had been opened and that a safety plan would need to be established before Sina was discharged from the hospital. She told me, without editorializing, that the safety plan would include restrictions on unsupervised contact between Sina and any family members involved in the incident. She said this calmly, but the implications moved through me like cold water. I called a lawyer that afternoon from a chair in the hospital corridor while Kofi sat with Sina in the NICU. The lawyer's name was Adize Okonkwo Briggs, a family law attorney with 16 years of practice who specialized in cases involving intersections of religious practice and child welfare law. She had been recommended by Dr. Sundaram's office manager, who apparently kept a list of such recommendations for exactly this category of situation. Adize picked up on the second ring, and when I described the situation, she said, "I'm going to need everything you have, and I need you to stop talking to your in-laws without me." I said I hadn't spoken to them since 4 a.m. She said, "Good, keep that." What followed in the next 72 hours was the specific exhaustion of a person navigating a medical crisis and a legal process simultaneously, while also trying to understand the shape of a marriage that had just revealed a structural failure she hadn't seen coming. Sina's temperature normalized within 18 hours. Her blood glucose stabilized within 24. Dr. Afalabi told me on the second morning that Sina was going to be fine with no predicted long-term consequences, and I sat with that for a long time. The specific, weighty gratitude of a close call that was close enough to be a different outcome but wasn't. The lawyer met with me for 2 hours on the second day and reviewed everything. Dr. Sundaram's written statement, which became Exhibit A in the documentation file Adiz began assembling, the text messages from Abina during the week before the ceremony, which I had saved, a voice memo I had made after the conversation with Desmond at the CPS information line, the printout of Dr. Sundaram's email that I had shown Kofi. She told me the documentation was strong. She told me what the potential legal exposure was for Kofi specifically, given that he had provided access to the bedroom. She said the word reckless endangerment in the careful way of a lawyer who is describing a legal category rather than rendering a verdict. I sat with that too. Kofi and I did not speak substantively for 3 days, which was not a decision either of us made deliberately, but was simply the shape of the situation. We were in the same hospital, moving around each other like objects following parallel paths, and the things that needed to be said were too large to start in a corridor. On the third day, in a family room at the end of the NICU hallway, we sat across from each other, and he talked for a long time. He said things I had heard before in different registers, and things I had not heard. The things I had heard before, that he had been caught between two loyalties he didn't know how to resolve, that he loved me and loved his family, and had believed somehow that both things could remain true through the same action, that he understood he had been wrong and was sorry. The thing I had not heard before, that he had given his mother the key. Not asked, not coerced. Given. At 1:15 a.m. he had gone to the door, heard nothing, and told himself that meant I had agreed. He had given his mother the key because part of him had wanted the ceremony to happen and the locked door to be an obstacle rather than a decision. He said that with a specificity that I understood had been arrived at through the 3 days of silence, and that had cost him something real to say. I did not respond immediately. I sat with it. Then I asked him what he wanted to happen now. He said he wanted his daughter to be safe, and his marriage to survive, and to become the kind of father who chose clearly when choosing was required. I said I needed those things too, but I needed to know whether the version of those things he was describing was real or was what he was telling himself, because the consequences of the alternative were too significant to face. He said he didn't know yet, and he thought the honest answer was that he was in the process of finding out. It was, again, the most honest thing he had said in days. And I decided to take it at face value because the alternative was deciding in a hospital corridor, and I was not ready to decide in a hospital corridor. The CPS safety plan was implemented before Sina's discharge. Constance Yeboah presented it in a formal meeting that included me, Kofi, Dr. Afolabi, a hospital social worker named Patience Asare, who had 6 years in family services, and Adesi by phone. The plan required supervised visitation for Abina and other family members involved in the incident, a mandatory parenting education component for Kofi, and a 6-month monitoring period with monthly home visits. Kofi signed it without objection. Abina was not present at the meeting. She had been notified of the plan through her son. Her response, relayed by Kofi, was that the state had no authority over family religious practice, and that she would seek counsel. Adesi, when I told her this, said, "She can seek whatever counsel she wants. The safety plan is operative regardless." The criminal referral question was one I had been sitting with since Ades first used the phrase reckless endangerment. She walked me through the options and the realistic outcomes, and what pursuing charges would mean in practice versus what declining to pursue them would mean. She was careful not to make the decision for me. I spent 2 days thinking about it, and then I made a decision that I want to describe accurately rather than simply. I decided not to push for criminal charges against Abina. This was not forgiveness in any simple sense. It was a calculation about what Sina would need for the first 10 years of her life and what a criminal proceeding involving her grandmother would cost that future. I told Adais my decision. She noted it without judgment and said the civil documentation remained available if circumstances changed. What I did push for, what Adais filed on my behalf, and what Kofi supported without requiring persuasion, which was the thing that told me most clearly about where his commitments had realigned, was a formal restraining order limiting Abina's contact with Sina to supervised visits in approved settings with a specific legal prohibition against any religious ceremony or ritual involving Sina without the documented consent of both parents. The order was granted by the family court in a hearing that Abina attended with her own attorney and opposed on religious freedom grounds. Judge Miriam Asante Cole, no relation to my daughter's NICU doctor, listened to both sides and issued the order anyway. She said, in language I have since memorized, "Religious freedom does not extend to the endangerment of an infant who cannot consent to the practice." I wrote that sentence in my notebook. I have kept it. The consequences distributed themselves over the following months in ways I am still tracking. Abina did not attend the actual naming ceremony we held 6 weeks after Sina came home. A quiet gathering of the people who had supported us through the hospitalization, an event notable for its warmth and its deliberate smallness. She sent a card that I read once and put away. The extended family divided along predictable lines. Some reached out with apologies that felt genuine, some reached out with apologies that felt performative, and some retreated into silence that said more than either. Kofi attended 8 months of individual therapy with a counselor named Dr. Ebenezer Aqua, who specialized in intergenerational family dynamics and religious identity, and the work he did there, the actual, specific, difficult work of examining what he had prioritized and why, produced a man who was meaningfully different in certain ways from the man who had given his mother a key at 1:15 in the morning. I attended my own therapy, separately, with a woman named Dr. Lena Pratt who specialized in trauma and relationship repair, and I spent 6 months in her office learning how to hold the two things that were true simultaneously: that I had married someone who had failed me in a fundamental way, and that the failure was not the complete account of who he was. That tension does not fully resolve. I think it shouldn't. The pressure of it is part of what makes the rebuilt thing worth building. Senna is 2 years old now. She has 4 teeth and strong opinions about which socks she will consent to wear, and an infectious laugh that has the specific quality of a sound you arrange your whole day around hearing. She does not know what happened in the garden when she was 11 days old. She will know someday. I have already decided that, and Kofi has agreed, because we are raising her with the understanding that the full truth of her life is something she has a right to. What we will tell her when she is old enough to hold it is this: that something dangerous happened to her before she could protect herself, and that the people who loved her learned, at significant cost, how to do better. That the word tradition requires the same scrutiny as any other word that people use to justify doing something to someone who cannot say no. That her father, when it mattered most, was late, and then was not. I keep Dr. Sundaram's email in a folder on my desktop, the printed copy in a file drawer. I keep the safety plan and the court order in the same drawer. Not as weapons, as records, as the documents that say, this happened and this was done about it, and the thing that mattered was protected. Sina is fine. She is more than fine. She wears one orange sock and one purple sock because she has decided that's the rule, and neither of us is arguing. She's safe. That's all that matters.